My name is Cheryl Moody, and I'm an owner of Atlantic Shores Environmental Services, and I've been in this industry for 30 years, so I've been doing it for a while. Julie, you can go to the next slide. This is my contact information if anybody wants to get in touch with me to discuss anything further after this meeting. Next slide, Julie. Okay, so we want to know what's going to impact our projects before we even move forward with the project, because if you find out this stuff after your project has already started, it usually causes huge problems and monetary issues with the project. So here's a list of things that are typically the highest issues that pop up during construction or during just a transaction. And I'm going to go through each one of these individually on the following slides. So you can go to the next slide, Julie. All right, so the first one's asbestos. Asbestos can be found in so many different areas of a building. You've got transite siding, tile and mastic, linoleum, popcorn ceilings. You guys can read this yourselves, but there's asbestos can be found in way more materials than people really think. And go to the next slide, Julie. People say, well, my building's not old, so there's no asbestos in it. Well, that's not necessarily true. You can still buy products that have asbestos in them. A lot of, you can go to Home Depot right now and buy roofing sealant that has asbestos in it. It might not say asbestos fibers, but it'll say Canadian fibers on it to make it not sound bad. But when things were banned, only certain things were banned. So depending on where you get your material from, there could still be regulated quantities of asbestos in them. And in North Carolina, there is a requirement for any renovation or demolition project that you have to conduct an asbestos survey before you can get your permit. A lot of contractors aren't really aware of this regulation, and the regulatory realm doesn't have many inspectors, so a lot of people are getting away with not doing it, unfortunately, but it is a requirement. Go ahead to the next slide, Julie. The next few slides are really just pictures of typically what we see that could have asbestos in it. The popcorn ceiling here, I would probably say about 50% of the time is positive. The 12 by 12 ceiling tiles, there's two ways that people put these up onto their ceilings. Is sometimes they'll do a wooden grid and they staple them on. But when they don't do that and they use glue, we basically call it a hockey puck, because it's basically just a daub of mastic, and they stick them onto the ceiling, and that mastic a lot of times has asbestos in it. Next slide, Julie. Pipe insulation. This could cause a huge problem for a project. Could be more than $100,000 worth of problem. This particular pipe insulation it was called air cell, and it basically looks like corrugated cardboard, but it's not. It's up to 60% asbestos. And you find this a lot of times in old industrial facilities or even in residential homes. You'll see it. Next slide, Julie. Now this is like a picture of a project that we worked on that it was found underneath a commercial structure. And this is a huge problem because you have this air cell is actually deteriorated to a point where you have it all over the ground, and you can't let anybody in there. No contractors can go in under here, and you're gonna have to abate this prior to doing any work. So you don't only have to abate the asbestos material that you see. This soil in this crawl space is now contaminated. So you have an additional cost of having to remove probably about 3 to 6 inches of dirt in the crawl space, which, as you can imagine, is pretty costly. Next slide. Here's just some more miscellaneous elbows on insulation. Sometimes you'll find fiberglass insulation, but the elbows are positive with asbestos because the mud that they use has asbestos in it. Next slide, Julie. This asbestos at transite siding, I'm showing you residential houses here, but you can also find it on commercial structures. Um, it, and it's basically, a transite is usually about 60% asbestos. Next slide. And this is miscellaneous materials. We've got window glazing, sink undercoatings. If you have old wiring in the facility, a lot of times the fabric wrap around the wiring contains asbestos. And then you have heat shields in places where there's high heat. That wallboard there actually has asbestos in it. Next slide. And then another thing to consider is hidden asbestos. A lot of times in these older facilities or older commercial buildings, instead of replacing the tile or the linoleum, they'll just go over it with a new layer. So you could have asbestos containing materials underneath a non-asbestos containing flooring. Next slide. The next thing is lead paint. Lead paint was banned in 1978 by the government, but there were stockpiles, so you could still find it in facilities built a few years after that. Go ahead and next slide, Julie. Now this is a residential statistic here, but it translates to commercial properties as well. This is from the US EPA. Basically anything that was built prior to 1940, 87% of the buildings have lead paint in it. And then, you know, it declines from there up to 69%, 24% between 1960 and 1977. Next slide, Julie. Okay, so how is lead paint going to affect my property, my commercial property? It usually doesn't affect commercial properties too much unless you have what's called a child occupied facility. And that is basically, you're going to have children under the age of 6 that are going to occupy the building for a certain amount of time each week, and up to about 60 hours a year annual visit. So if you do fall into that category, say you have a daycare or a church or something like that, you are going to be subject to the EPA's RRP rule, which is renovation, repair, and painting rule. So any renovations or any kind of work that's done in those particular facilities, you have to have contractors that are licensed by the state to provide these services and to provide lead safe practices during their work. Next slide, Julie. All right, so underground storage tanks and above ground storage tanks could cause a problem with the property if they're being used or not used. If they're abandoned, there could have been leaks. If there's a leak in the tank, then it becomes regulated, and depending on how much has leaked out into the groundwater or soil, you could have a large remediation project on your hands. So you should always make sure to identify if there are tanks or were former tanks on the property. Next slide. Another issue is water intrusion and mold growth. There are so many water sources that could potentially cause water issues or mold issues in a building. You could have, you know, roof leaks, pipe breaks, plumbing leaks, floods from outside the building, moisture intrusion within the bottom the building envelope. An improperly operating HVAC system. If it's cycling on and off too fast, it's not going to be able to take the humidity out of the air. If you have above 60% relative humidity for, you know, more than 48 hours, you could have spontaneous mold growth just from being able to take that moisture out of the air. If you have a negative pressure envelope, say, you know, that means your air is getting sucked into the building instead of a positive pressure, which would mean your inside air is actually getting pushed out, which is more, you want that to be present. Improperly graded sites. If you've got water pooling next to your foundation, that could cause another problem. Next slide. Okay, these are just pictures of issues that could happen. We've got 1980 vintage construction in this area tended to use this type of construction where you had insulation, then you had a plastic wrap, and then the drywall. And you can see from this one picture that mold growth happens between the plastic and the insulation. Leaky skylights, leaking hot water heaters, condensation on HVAC supplies. We have a really hot, humid climate here. So if you have your air conditioner too low, and you don't have good insulation around these penetrations and these vents, you're gonna have condensation and you're gonna have growth. Next slide, Julie. Wetlands are another big one in this area. We live at the coast, and there's a lot of wetlands. Basically, wetlands are defined by three things: hydric soils, hydrology, and wetland vegetation. You have to have all three for it to be classified as a wetland. But the problem with wetlands on your property is you can't build in those wetlands unless you have a permit. Julie, can you go to the next slide? So hydric soils are basically soils that have been inundated by water long enough where we have anaerobic conditions. And hydrology means that there's presence of water, does not have to be 100% of the time there. And wetland vegetation is basically hydrophilic vegetation that's present. But wetlands aren't always wet. If you look at the picture down in the right-hand corner, these are taken in two different seasons. In the spring, and obviously everything's wet. In the fall, if you were walking out here, you might not think that that's a wetland. One of my biggest concerns with people that purchase property that's marginally wetlands, they wouldn't be considered wetlands as they are presented, but they go out there and clear their property because they're getting ready for everything. And then because they've changed the vegetation, all of a sudden now wetland vegetation start germinating. And when before you only had maybe hydrology and soils, you didn't have the wetland vegetation. Now you've cleared your property and you've allowed for those wetland plants to germinate because there's nothing that's stopping them from growing. So I always warn my clients not to clear unless it's already been verified by the Corps. Next slide. All right, so how is wetlands going to affect my property? So basically, I mean, the pros of it is a wildlife habitat. Nobody can build on it. So, you know, if you have wetlands behind your new development, then that might be a good thing. The cons are you can't build in it. The only exceptions to that is if you have, you can impact less than 1/10 of an acre with what's called a pre-construction notification. If you want to impact more than 1/10 of an acre, you're going to have to get apply for a major permit, which could cost quite a bit of money because you're probably going to have to buy into a wetland bank to offset your impacts. It limits your usable land for construction, and it may increase your development costs or have to change your conceptual plans. If somebody's already designed what they want on the property and then realize, well, a third of that property is wet and I can't build on it, now what am I going to do? It's also, you know, potential mosquito habitat. Next slide, Julie. There's a lot of miscellaneous things that kind of pop up during commercial real estate transactions. And honestly, all the stuff I've been talking about is specifically for commercial real estate, but it also translates to residential properties. So if you're having residential, if you're doing a residential transaction, a lot of these will also be applicable. So flood zone, you really want to make sure you're not in a flood zone or near a flood zone. In particular, on the coast here, we've had a lot of flooding issues, even in areas that weren't flood zones. What happens is with all the construction and a new pervious material or impervious material that's been put down, the flood zones change. So you can't 100% rely on what the flood zone is telling you, unfortunately, in this area. CAMA, which is Coastal Area Management Act, that's includes 20 coastal counties in the state of North Carolina. And you have setback rules and what things that you can and can't do within those areas. And it's not just at the ocean. I mean, we're talking about including areas upriver of the coast. If you're in a water supply area, it's included. Other issues are North Carolina watershed restoration plans. An example of that is the Tar-Pamlico River. There's a lot of regulations for those particular areas. If you're constructing or purchasing or renovating in those particular areas, you need to know what the requirements are. Mercury vapor lights and other hazardous materials. There's a picture here of what a mercury vapor light looks like typically. These are considered hazardous materials, and if you purchase a property that has these things, you're going to have to properly dispose of these materials, which could cost, it's going to add to your costs. So next slide, Julie. Other miscellaneous PCB containing equipment, light ballasts, capacitors, transformers. We recently had a client who purchased a property at auction. They had some transformers on the property. It was an old commercial property, and the transformers contain PCBs. Originally, they were going to renovate the property right away, so they didn't do anything with respect to those transformers, but unfortunately, it sat idle for about 8 years. And because of that, the EPA was following up on some of their records, and this client got fined over $60,000 because they didn't keep up with their reporting requirements. So if you do have a property that has PCBs, that's one thing that has to be done. You have to keep up with that, whether or not you're going to keep using them or if you're going to get them disposed of. You still have to keep up with those requirements. Cemeteries, specifically cemeteries that was built that have interments of 1910 or earlier. The embalming practices back then included the use of arsenic, and we've seen that groundwater contaminated with arsenic happens around these cemeteries. Dry cleaners and the gas stations, whether it's on your site or nearby your site, it could be a potential problem with VOC emissions into the building. You may have to install a vapor barrier system in a new construction, or even retrofit existing facilities if it's an issue. Drainage issues, as I talked about with the water intrusion issues. You can have erosion issues. You can have water intrusion into the building causing mold issues. You could have structural issues if it's wood construction. On-site septic systems, depending on the former use of the property, you could have, who knows what you put down or who the former owners put down the septic system. That could cause soil and groundwater contamination on the property. Next slide. All right, so these are other potential natural resource roadblocks to development. If you're using any kind of public funding, you are going to have to check, you're going to have to go through NEPA basically, and you're going to have to check endangered species, you're going to have to check historical buildings, any kind of features, tribal or artifacts, National Registry of Historic Places. Typically, this doesn't come into play if you're not using public funds. So just note that. Next slide. All right. So, I told you about all this stuff, but how do you identify these risks on your projects prior to them becoming a major issue because you didn't budget for it? You should always get a phase 1 environmental site assessment on commercial property transactions. These are going to help identify the majority of the issues that we spoke about, and it will also provide circle liability for the buyer if there was anything found down the line. You can get a wetland survey. It's good for 5 years. After those 5 years, you will have to redo it if you haven't done anything with the property yet. You should get an asbestos inspection to identify what asbestos is present in the building. You don't necessarily have to abate asbestos. If there's no hazard, you can leave it in place um, with a management plan. And but anything that could potentially cause an issue, or if you just want to get rid of it, you should have the asbestos survey up front so that you can know for budgetary purposes for the abatement. Lead-based paint survey as well. These I would definitely do for residential properties, and if you have a child occupied facility or a proposed child occupied facility in your property. Indoor air quality services survey, like mold or volatile organic compounds. If there's a potential issue with the property with respect to mold, if somebody's noticing that there was a leak and there's mold growth on the walls, or if there is a known VOC impacts to groundwater in the area, you might want to consider doing a VOC sampling inside the building. Next slide. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about brownfield sites. And I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with what brownfield sites are or not, but brownfield site is basically an idle piece of property that is likely to have environmental contamination on it, which has hindered its redevelopment. There are two programs. There's a federal program, which is basically provides funding to government agencies, economic development, redevelopment agencies to help identify, assess, clean up brownfield sites. State programs is the second program. Each state has their own program. They're all differ a little bit. Next slide, Julie. So in the state of North Carolina, there are two paths. You can do the normal path for the brownfield redevelopment. It's an $8,000 fee, including any fees that a consultant would pass on to actually help with the application and all that. If you're in a rush and you have the funds, you can go develop now. That's a $30,000 fee. The state says that there's an expedited turnaround there. In my experience recently, that hasn't really been too much of the case. The Brownfield group has had a lot of changes in the past year, which have slowed down a lot of the Brownfield projects. But so the cons to having doing this as a brownfield is you have to pay the DEQ fees, you have to pay an environmental attorney, you will have consulting fees, and you have yearly reporting. The pros, though, I think greatly outweigh the cons. You've got liability protection. There's a tax incentive for 5 years after your construction or your redevelopment has occurred. You likely don't have to remediate impacts that have been identified to state standards, as long as there's no immediate danger to life or health. You usually are allowed to leave those impacts on the site. Next slide, Julie. Okay, so why do you want to do a brownfield site? So say you're looking at a project and you just want to buy it and redevelop it. Why should I do the brownfield? Well, as I talked about in the previous slide, those tax incentives are huge. I mean, if you have a piece of property that you're going to demo and say it's worth, $1 million, but after your redevelopment, it's worth $5.5 million. So basically, you get to write off the difference between the $1 million and the $5.5 million assessment for the first year. I think it's 90% of that. And then it tiers down for 5 years percentage-wise. So depending on the value of your property, you could conceivably save a lot of money going brownfield route. Plus you have the liability protection and you don't have to remediate to state standards. I just listed here some projects that we're working on right now. In Wilmington, there's the Pier 33 project downtown, and WWAY, which is actually on a adjacent corner to Pier 33. In Rocky Mount, North Carolina, we're working on a Rocky Mount Mills project. It's one of the largest brownfield projects in the state. It's about 120 acres and includes 2 textile mills. and surrounding Mill Village and some other commercial properties. North Carolina, I mean, Durham, North Carolina, we have 5 active projects right now. University Ford is being redeveloped as part of the American Tobacco Campus, and American Tobacco Campus is another brownfield project. There is a railroad lot adjacent to the Durham Performing Arts Center, and then a park adjacent to the new Aloft Hotel that's there. Next slide, Julie. So, I mean, that's basically it. I kind of went through those slides pretty quickly, but so I just opened it up to questions and we can talk about anything you guys want.
I learned a lot. I was particularly interested in the Brownfield sites. You know, I had heard about some people doing that, and I know we have another member, Amy, who, you know, wanted to do a presentation about that with some people. So that was a nice little nugget that I wasn't expecting to hear today. So that was pretty cool.
Anybody else have any questions? Comments? Anything?
Yeah, Cheryl, that was a good overview. And we have a large environmental department that works with you.
Right.
But I learn something new every time. It's just a big, complex subject. There's so many different impacts. It's, I'm glad you got a nice handle on it. So yeah, thank you for that. It was good.
Okay.
I don't have any questions.
All right.
And Cheryl, thank you from me as well. I mean, obviously I'm in a completely different country, so it's a different set of issues, but actually a lot of those issues are very similar here. In the UK, there's been a lot of new development on floodplains, which, as you can imagine, is incredibly problematic. There's a huge push towards redevelopment of brownfield sites because there's very limited land in the UK that you can actually build on. So a lot of it is brownfield, and in a lot of areas, large, sort of a lot of the buildings, particularly housing specifically, are all protected. So they can't sort of be knocked down and what have you. A little bit different in some of the city centres. But yeah, it's a lot of the same issues. One of the key issues here actually is kind of substandard housing and particular issues with mold and damp and very poor kind of thermal regulation. So I think there's also that really interesting question around how you advise people for kind of what might happen in the next 5 or 10 years as a result of changing weather patterns, climate change, all of these sorts of things. Because, you know, in some areas, certainly in the UK, if it hits over about 25 degrees Celsius, I can't remember what that is in Fahrenheit, but particularly in London, I mean, it's not that hot. I'm Australian, so 25 is not hot at all. But in cities like London, it becomes unbearable. And once it hits about 30 degrees, it's absolutely stifling because the houses are not made for heat at all. And they just kind of get warmer and warmer and warmer, and you're all sitting around melting. And most of us don't have air conditioning because the houses, you know, it's never been needed. So, yeah, so how are you kind of advising and planning for people sort of 5, 10, 15 years ahead?
Well, I mean, mold is kind of, it's kind of a tough nut to crack because right now there's no regulations in place because, so say you have a contaminant like benzene, there have been studies done, you know, and who's going to be affected, what the LD50 is, all those kind of things.
Yeah.
But for mold, everybody's susceptibility is completely different.
Yeah.
So they have not put out any standards whatsoever. And the whole industry really is not regulated. Unfortunately, here in the United States, anybody can own a mold remediation company.
Okay.
There is a company or an entity called ACAC, which is American Council for Accredited Certification, who's the only third-party entity that does accreditations for mold remediation professionals. in indoor air quality professionals, and it is approved by the engineering board. But besides that, you've got other certifications throughout the states that are individual certifications. It's not a federal program or anything.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's, unfortunately, we're just kind of all learning this now because we're all just kind of trudging through it. There's no guidance at this point. With respect to the temperature, unfortunately, I mean, if you've got high temperatures and relative humidity above 60%, you could potentially have mold growth just spontaneously. So, I mean, that's an issue. If you've got 60% high or higher humidity in a home for longer than 48 hours, you could have a potential issue.
Yeah. I think it's going to become an increasing issue. I mean, part of the challenge in the UK is, at least on the housing stock, 80% of what we'll be living in 2050 has already been built. Of that, only 1% meet the EPC kind of rating of A. So in terms of energy performance, that's an energy performance rating. So there's a huge amount that needs to be done to retrofit. And that will both be residential as well as kind of commercial properties. But that'll cost lots of money. So it's the question about who actually pays for it, particularly because you've got lots of social housing in the UK, or actually to get to zero carbon buildings, it does increase kind of build costs and stuff. So it's that really knotty issue that I think probably everyone has around who pays.
Right. Okay.
Anyone else? Well, thank you all so much for attending. Just want to give a shout out to some of our partners. Thank you, Live Oak. Thank you, Logan and Odyssey. We've got lots of great partners. I'll just leave them here so you can see them. But thank you guys so much for attending today. We have several events coming up. I'll make sure that we get this hopefully updated on our YouTube channel so you guys can kind of do a recap. Please make sure to reach out to Cheryl if you have any questions or can use her services on an upcoming project. My biggest takeaway is do the work up front so you don't have to deal with the issues in the back end.
Definitely.
Which for my type A brain, I'm all about it. I think that's very, very smart. So thank you so much, Cheryl, for sharing your expertise with us.